The meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. A month or two back, some of you may remember, I spoke about Russian dolls. I asked you to use your imagination. Take one apart. What might be at its centre? If you were the Tsar of all the Russias and you'd commissioned it from Fabergé as a birthday present for the Tsarina, it might hide at its core an exquisite diamond. Buy a Russian doll at a shop on the high street, on the other hand, and the last doll is likely to be a small, solid, shapeless lump. In your imagination, however, you might envisage an infinite set of ever smaller dolls, getting smaller and smaller until you need an electron microscope and some quantum tweezers to pull them apart. A friend of mine who's a psychotherapist does that exercise with his clients, getting them to peel away layer upon layer of themselves until, generally to their horror, they find an empty space at the centre where they thought their heart might have been. Scientists nowadays have a way of dealing with mysteries. They know they're only going to be able to get so far. Physics as a subject, for instance. Physics was ambling along quite happily until the time of Newton, who took it by the scruff of the neck and pulled the subject into shape. Job done. All questions answered. Until Max Planck and Albert Einstein came along. It wasn't that Newton was wrong, just that what he wrote was incomplete. And now we have quantum mechanics, and it's clear that Einstein himself was incomplete. Science may get the answers, but in the face of mysteries, science needs first to develop and grow, and then possibly even the human mind itself needs to develop and grow to encompass new ways of understanding. Archimedes and Euclid, remember, they were no less smart than the physicists of today, but their minds were trapped in a maze from which they needed to be liberated into the next maze. It's not clear, and by the way, I should make it clear that I myself don't have a scientific bone in my body. It's not clear whether the intellectual icebreakers will be able to clear a path right on through, or whether some things will remain inexplicable. Time, consciousness, gravity, space, mind, they're all proving hard nuts to crack. Multiple universes, as many dimensions as you can imagine, and more. Theorists are saying about it, don't think, just do the maths. Whether deeper understanding will come as minds develop to encompass them, or whether the minds will simply find ways of blurring the truth to make it seem comprehensible. Well, these are age-old questions that won't be answered anytime soon. One example I'm thinking of, what is life? At school we learned how to identify life, respiration, reproduction and so on, and that still stands, though we may need to make a bit of adjustment if we find something on Mars that doesn't quite fit. I'm a linguist more than I'm a scientist, and we learned as linguists that the best way to understand a language is to start writing in that language. So in the search for truth about life, you might like to suggest to a biologist that he'll understand life best if he tries creating some of it in a test tube. What material would you need to create a life from scratch? How would you manipulate this non-living material so that it began to respire, reproduce, and so on. And having made it, how could you be sure that it was natural life, as it were, rather than something more robotic? And more realistically, how do you explain the awkward fact that is not actually ever going to happen? You're never going to be able to create something living anyway. It's unfortunate that science and religion diverged so early. Not just those two, but a whole plethora of academic disciplines now have opinions on what life is. Philosophers and lexicographers were in there early. I joked to someone once that there was only one academic discipline that couldn't have bio put in front of it, namely astrophysics. And she replied, "My fiancé is a bioastrophysicist." You may be asking what all this has to do with today's gospel, and you'd be right to do so. It is all a bit tenuous. Let me come at it from another direction. We talk about body and soul, and we might file that kind of talk as spiritual or religious. But secular philosophers do talk about the ghost in the machine. Atheists are stumped by the mind-body problem. We have something here that, if we're honest, which on this subject we find it difficult to be, if we're honest, it has us foxed. A lot of people talk of the soul leaving the body at the time of death. But that's not language that Jesus or his contemporaries would have ever contemplated using, because Judaism and Christianity never thought of a separate soul and body. The word we might translate as soul really only means life, in the same way as blood or breath meant life. As far as they were concerned, the body didn't have two separate parts. It was an animated body. The two were completely integrated. If, as we believe, death is not annihilation, it doesn't follow then that we survive as souls or spirits. But how we might survive is beyond us. Getting a better idea of what it might mean is more likely to do with getting a better understanding of time rather than biology or theology. Time, we're assured nowadays, time, we're told, by people who haven't got a clue but indulge them because they're doing their best. Time is a mental construct. Time is a matter for the human mind, or perhaps universal mind, who knows, but it's a mental construct. Time is a kind of rack and pinion railway that carries us all together in one direction, and one direction only. Because we feel we've passed through 2020 and we're glad to see the back of it, doesn't mean that 2020 has ceased to exist, any more than Pangbourne ceases to exist as the train moves on to Tilehurst. Existence in time, leave alone existence outside time, it's far more complicated, far more unfathomable than we're able to grasp. And it's not clear that we're ever going to be able to grasp it. In a sense, of course, it doesn't actually matter. Our lives are no more rich or no more fulfilling than lives that were lived 2 millennia ago. Back in 0 BC, as it were, they hadn't peeled away as many layers of the Russian doll as perhaps we have, but they did live lives of hope and great potential as we continue to do ourselves. I'm not sure that we see any less dimly in a mirror than they did. The important truth about the Russian doll parable is what my psychotherapist friend would say. You remember he'd get his patients to peel away layer after layer until to the horror they found there was nothing there in the middle. He'd allow them a little time of anguish and anxiety at this terrifying sense of nothingness. And then he'd begin the process of healing by showing them three things, because he himself was a believer. First, he'd demonstrate to them that the layers they'd discarded as they drilled on down to the centre. The layers they'd discarded, well, it was in that rich, encompassing growth that their life was lived and nurtured. Secondly, that the empty hole at the centre only seemed so because they'd been looking for the wrong thing. In fact, the hole in the middle is a place of sanctuary, a safe place where you're most truly yourself. If you can learn to be at home there, you'll find a sense of peace that will pervade the whole of the rest of you. But thirdly, and he's careful who he says this to, the truths of our faith don't at all depend on how well we understand the mechanics of the cosmos. Love, sacrificial living, peace, beauty, reverence, willingness to serve, an appreciation of the importance of things, a realization that our faith is the way, that any kindness in the universe, any consciousness, any understanding is lodged in us, together with a responsibility to care for it all. But equally that humanity is small and helpless compared with the benign power that gave us life, which, though infinite and unimaginable, can nonetheless be seen in Jesus, tasted in bread and wine, heard wherever Scripture is read, recognized whenever we search in our neighbours' faces for the eyes of Christ our friend. Put the Russian doll back together. Feel the warmth that fills the whole of it, and the light that shines at its centre. Understand that the uncomprehending, apparently indifferent universe that surrounds us, in fact, resonates in harmony with us. All this gives us a security that can never be overcome. "Sir, we would see Jesus," said those Greeks. They had no idea what they were asking. Blessed are we who have not seen and yet have believed.